Eastern Europe has always fascinated me, and for most of the 20th century, of course, the dark green area on this map was the Soviet Union. It was a time of oppression, invasion, and a yearning to be free. And as we know, in 1991, people's dreams came true and it was swept away. I looked at this huge region in 2015, wondering how to do justice to it. I actually started my trip in Poland and then travelled through Moldova, Crimea, and finally to the Russian Caucasus, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Now, we need to have a look at the politics of this region on the map. The brown and yellow areas are what we call Georgia, but the yellow areas are lived in by mostly ethnic Russian people who look not to Georgia but to Moscow. That was okay under the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union broke up, those people said, we are not going to be ruled by Georgians. The first to break into violence was Abkhazia on the left, and it was brutal. Neighbour slaughtered neighbour, and by the end, some 28,000 people had lost their lives. The survivors, the Georgian survivors, fled to the brown part of Georgia, where 25 years later I met some of them, still refugees after all those years. And it breaks your heart because Abkhazia is such a beautiful place set at the western end of the Caucasus range. You can go camping, hiking, fishing, horse riding. That's my tent there. And if you go down to the coast, you'll find the capital, Sukhumi, a gloriously faded former Soviet Black Sea resort where everything is crumbling, rather. I shouldn't laugh because many of the things that are crumbling are houses that were lived in by Georgian people, of course, and are now empty. Other things are, well, this is a railway bridge, and I did notice that when a train went over, people did hang back a bit just in case something fell off. So some parts are crumbling picturesquely, and others are just plain ugly. And talking of plain ugly, a local journalist said to me, if you want to understand what happened during the conflict, go to this housing estate on the edge of Sukhumi. So I did that. As I approached, I thought, well, it's just an ordinary former Soviet housing estate, but it is not ordinary at all. Can you see what's happened here? Most of the apartments have been shelled, and that is because they used to belong to Georgians. They were shelled by Abkhaz forces using equipment supplied by Russia. And I went into that block. I shouldn't have done, really. It was really dangerous. But I wanted to see with my own eyes the damage that had been done. Outside, there were some couple of boys playing in amongst the rubble and the weeds, and then their mum came out and she was very friendly and she invited me in for coffee. But to get to her apartment, we had to go up this staircase. I said to her, how do you live like this? And she just shrugged her shoulders and said, well, we're used to it. It doesn't matter. She didn't want me to take photos of her apartment, but she invited some neighbours down for coffee, and I asked them the same question. How do you manage in all this? And they said the same thing. No, it doesn't matter. We survive. And so even in Abkhazia, life goes on. There are actually no shortages. There's plenty of food to buy, and if it's home furnishings you want, well, that's available too. Now, back to the map. I'd hoped to go to the other yellow area, South Ossetia, but the South Ossetian authorities said a firm no to that. So instead I went around to the northern side, to the Republic of North Ossetia, which is a sleepy sort of place. Nothing much happens. Boys joke and play as they go home from school. Elderly gentlemen gossip in the evening sunshine. But in 2004, an incident happened which nobody in North Ossetia will ever forget. Do you remember the Beslan school siege? Well, Beslan number 1 high school opened its doors for the autumn term on the 1st of September 2004. The assembly started at 9 o'clock, and at 9:10, the terrorists attacked. The siege that followed lasted 3 days, and towards the end of it, the terrorists started to murder their victims one by one. At that point, the Russian special forces moved in, and at that moment, the terrorists had been holding their victims in the gymnasium. The terrorists blew the roof off the gymnasium. That was when most of the victims perished, and there were more than 300 of them. Pupils and teachers, of course. The school's closed now. They built a new school, and the wreckage of the gymnasium has been enclosed in this rather clever, I think, shroud monument, which it looks as if you can draw back the bronze curtains and go inside. And if you do go inside, of course, the first thing you will see is the names of all the victims. I found the place quite crowded. It was just an ordinary weekday afternoon, but there were people milling around, and I wondered, I didn't ask this lady, but was she a grandma? Perhaps a great-grandma? Perhaps the mother of a teacher? Because many members of staff were victims as well. And it was only towards the end of the afternoon that I finally got the place to myself, so I could have 5 minutes to just wonder what drove the terrorists to do this. Well, the terrorists came from 2 neighbouring republics, Chechnya and Ingushetia, which are Russia's 2 Muslim majority republics. And so to perhaps understand a little more, I decided to go to one of those, Ingushetia. That is the green one, the dark green one on this map. Ingushetia has a history that goes back more than 1,000 years and is famous for its refuge towers, where people used to go in medieval times, in times of danger. So this has been a violent part of the world for generations. But all I can say is that of all the wonderful, warm, generous people I met on this trip, the Ingush were the most fabulous of all. They welcomed me like a brother, and I met several interesting people, most of all this gentleman here, who I met in a mosque, and he spoke quite good English, and we had a chat, and he said to me, "We don't like the Russians." So I thought to myself, okay, here we go again. But then he said, and first of all, he said, well, you can't blame us. Stalin deported half of us to Central Asia. And then he said something interesting, and the Russians don't like us, and I don't blame them. I thought, goodness, here is a man who can see both sides of the story. And if we're to have peace in the world, we all have to do that, don't we? It is so difficult. I can't do it. Autumn was turning to winter, and it was nearly time to come home. But before doing so, I wanted to visit one of the most sensitive borders of them all, the Russian-Georgian border, which mostly runs along the peaks of the Caucasus. I'd visited the other side of this mountain in Georgia some years previously, so I thought it'd be interesting to see the northern side, the Russian side. And sure enough, I was brought up pretty soon by these signs here, so I ignored them, carried on, and a few 100 yards further, I was stopped by a Russian soldier. He looked about 12 years old, and very politely he turned me around and sent me back the way I'd come, because Russia is really worried about the possibility of a Georgian invasion. I don't think little Georgia is going to invade mighty Russia anytime soon, but they are taking no chances. When I'd been in Georgia, I'd seen a thriving mountain culture in the Caucasus, where in springtime the people take their sheep and goats and cattle up to the high pastures where they will stay all summer long, making cheese and milk and butter and yogurt, and honey. But but on the northern side, that has all gone. The shepherds' huts, where they used to spend the summertime, are derelict. And looking closely at these, I thought that they had probably been abandoned at about the time of the conflict in the early 1990s. And those people, of course, will never return. It's politicians who make war, but it's always the ordinary people who suffer from it. Well, they've asked me to say a little bit more about my 2015 trip, so I'm going to talk now about Crimea. In 1954, Mr. Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine, and in 2014, Mr. Putin took the peninsula back again. It's slightly bigger than Wales, and along the south coast has a fabulous range of mountains, but unlike the green, wet Caucasus, this is dry country. It's actually limestone rock, so any rain that does fall goes straight underground. And wherever you go, you will see the Crimean flag and the Russian flag flying alongside. The Crimean one on the right, a reminder that this used to be Russian, going right back to the time of Catherine the Great. And I honestly don't think this is going to change anytime soon, if only because the Russian Black Sea Fleet is on permanent standby. And a little way up the coast from there is a place we've all heard of, Balaclava. Balaclava, most famous in Britain for the Charge of the Light Brigade, but in Russia it's more well known for something inside that hill on the left. Dating from the Cold War, it is a nuclear submarine base underground. And when I say nuclear, I mean nuclear powered and nuclear armed. And of course, this was a time of great tension between East and West. And so the Soviets decided to base their submarines inside the mountain. And the base closed in 1993, and it's now a very popular tourist attraction. And I do recommend it. You can walk for hundreds and hundreds of yards down these bleak, long corridors and pass through the steel and concrete doorways. Imagining what the workers there must have felt like when they might have been attacked at any time. This is where the submarines were docked. Shame there isn't one there now for scale, but they do have a real nuclear warhead. Disarmed, I think, well, I hope, because I gave it a thwack with my with my fist. And from there I went on eastwards to Yalta, somewhere else we've all heard of. Yalta became famous in the mid-19th century as Russia's resort on the Black Sea. And that was when the first of the famous gingerbread houses were built. And today it lives on, and more so because President Putin has been exhorting all patriotic Russians to go and spend their holidays in Yalta. And they have responded, because there's plenty to see around this area, including the famous Swallow's Nest, built by an eccentric German oil tycoon just over 100 years ago. It's now a very popular wedding venue. You have to be a little bit careful after a few drinks, but perhaps a more famous place is nearby, the Livadia Palace. The Livadia Palace was the country cottage, the dacha of the Tsars of the 19th and early 20th century. Dacha means country cottage, but this is some cottage, as you can see. I suppose if you're a head of state, you're allowed a bit of pomp. But Livadia Palace has had its share of tragedy, because it was here in 1917 that Tsar Nicholas II and his family spent an idyllic winter holiday before going back to Moscow to face the Bolshevik Revolution, where the following year they were all executed. But the Livadia Palace is perhaps more famous nowadays for something that happened in 1945, the Yalta Conference, when the victorious superpowers after the Second World War met to carve up the map of Europe. And I do find it incredible that as recently as 1945, one of those superpowers was the UK. And there are the three leaders posing for their official photograph: Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill. Stalin was a very small man, and he had a bit of a thing about it. And so for this important official photograph, he apparently demanded 2 cushions to sit on. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, well, it worked, didn't it? Because he looks almost taller than the other 2. And the event is commemorated by a wonderful bronze sculpture outside the palace. I did look underneath Stalin's bottom there. I could see no cushions, but maybe that was just artistic license. Well, from three great men to a great woman. This is a lady I met who was a Crimean Tatar. The Tatars were the original inhabitants of the peninsula. That's well before the Russians. But she told me a harrowing story about how in 1944, as a young girl, she was loaded with her family onto cattle trucks and sent off to Central Asia. Because Stalin thought the Tatars were colluding with the Germans. They weren't at all, but she was only allowed back in 1977. What a life she has led. And here is another Tatar of a younger generation who I met in the great central market of Yalta, who told me, we Tatars, we think of ourselves as Ukrainians. We don't like being ruled by Russia, and they cause us such problems. You can't get a passport, and if you need the essential work permit, the queues go round the block. Well, that's it. If you'd like to know more about places I've been, visit my website, pilk.net, and thank you very much for watching.